This is our Simondon study group coming back to Simondon again after our little detour. We're picking up from chapter 2 of the complement in volume 2, the consequences of the notion of individuation. So last time we read chapter 1 of this relatively short text. So we looked at the notion of relative and absolute values. That's the first section of the text. And so values for Simondon here are what sort of governs the compatibility of different elements of action. And so he talks about the organic and technical conditions of action as being made compatible by values in various ways. And then he talks about culture as playing the role of the absolute values. So culture makes compatible the organic and technical necessities or conditions of action. So there are certain conditions that human beings are subject to as living beings, and then there are conditions of technicity, and then the values that make up culture are what makes those two sets of conditions compatible with each other. And then he talks about the relationship between the individual and the group. So he argues again against what he calls substantialism. So this would be the idea that the individual is a sort of substance that is like self-contained, and then in that conception it starts to become difficult to explain how the individual is integrated into the group, or the relationship between the group and the individual is one of conflict or contestation of some kind, where there's a interest of the individual and interest of the group, and those two interests are incompatible with each other, and so there has to be some sort of compromise on the part of the individual to integrate into the group. And so he wants to recenter the understanding of action and in a way that doesn't have this same incompatibility between the individual and the group. And so he talks about in the next section this notion of the problematic or the problem, and so in moral reasoning or moral thinking, you can have a problem presented to the subject. So there's a problem about what the right thing to do is, or what course of action to pursue, and then it's by working through this problem and selecting a course of action that the subject makes different interests compatible with each other, and so it's that process of working through the problem that we're interested in, rather than an understanding of moral reasoning and moral thinking that is sort of oriented around the notion of choice. Because when you talk about a choice, you're presenting two options, and then the subject is supposed to select one of those options, but it's only ever a problem when there's no way of actually selecting one of those options, and so the subject has to sort of pick at random, I don't know, flip a coin or whatever, to say I'm going to do action 1 instead of action 2. So this whole sort of framework for the problem, and you can think of like the trolley problem or these types of examples that are sort of well known in moral philosophy. These types of problems are sort of setting the way the whole problem is set up is sort of insoluble. It's just a choice between two options that are set up to be undecidable, or is set up in such a way that you can't make a decision between the two. And so rather than centering our moral thinking around choice, Simondon wants to center it around the notion of resolving a problem or coming to solve a problem, and making compatible what was not compatible before. And then so he talks about moral consciousness or conscience, and this is a sort of second order regulation of the living being. So the living being as such has a a regulation as part of its functioning. It preserves certain states. It keeps its temperature at a certain level or within a certain range. It keeps the ratios of different substances in its blood at a certain level, and so on. It preserves itself in this state or a range of states, and so it's homeostatic in the cybernetic terminology. And so this is a sort of first order regulation of the living being, but the actual states, the goal states that its regulation is oriented towards are sort of predetermined or are a sort of fixed set of states, whereas individuals or entities that have a moral consciousness or a conscience are capable not only of this sort of regulation towards goal states, but also of electing goal states towards which it's going to be oriented. So you can decide to structure your life around a certain goal state and preserve or orient your behavior around regulating a certain goal state. And this is what Simondon describes as freedom here. So it's not, freedom doesn't have to do necessarily with choice in the sort of classical sense. Freedom has to do with being able to select the goal states of your behavior and your action. And then he talks about how there can be sort of failures of conscience, or what happens when you don't allow this conscience to act in the way that he described in the previous section. And so he talks about the role of stereotypes, and so here we have the group sort of tendencies, or he uses the term instincts as well. So you have these sort of immediate reactions to other people that don't belong to your group in whatever way, and from a different nation or class or whatever group you want to use. You have this immediate reaction that these people are dirty, or they're immoral, or stupid, or whatever. You have this immediate negative reaction to people from a different group, and so he sees this as being a failure of conscience, because you are not allowing your immediate reactions to be sort of reoriented or restructured by the action of conscience. And then so the last bit of the chapter, he talks about how he makes this distinction between societies and communities, with community being a sort of biological concept or organic concept, and then society being an ethical concept. And he suggests that there's a difference between societies and communities in terms of their scale of values, so that a community has a set of values that has a positive and a negative pole. So there's good and there's bad, or good and evil, or whatever pair of positive and negative valorizations. Whereas in a society, there's only degrees of positivity. So there's the good and the neutral, or the good and less good. And so there's this difference in the scale of values is what characterizes the difference between societies, which have this quality of openness and progressive development, as opposed to communities which have a closed character and are sort of just sort of maintain themselves in their current state. And of course, these are not communities and societies are not sort of two distinct sets of groups of people. It's each group of people has some aspect of community and some aspect of society that interact in complicated ways. And that's about where we ended up last time. So we can pick up from page 410, the beginning of the second chapter. I'll let someone else read since I just gave that long introduction. So if someone else would like to read the first page or so.
Sure, I can go. Sorry about that. Chapter 2, Individuation and Invention. Section 1, The Technician as Pure Individual. Technical activity, consequently, can be considered as an introductory element to veritable social reason and an initiatory element to the sense of the freedom of the individual. In fact, the community identifies the individual with his function, which is organic or technical. Yet, while it can totally identify the individual with his organic function and his organic state, the young, the old, the warrior, it cannot make him totally adhere to his technical function. For example, in the Homeric tales, the figure of the physician is depicted all by himself as equivalent to several warriors, Polon and Taxios Esti, and is therefore honored with this in mind. This is because the physician is the technician of healing. He has a magical power. His strength is not purely social, like that of the chief or the warrior. His social function is what results from his individual power, and not the other way around. The physician is more than man, defined by his integration into the group. He is all by himself. He has a gift that is given to him alone, that is not taken from society, and that defines the consistency of his directly grasped individuality. He isn't just a member of a society, but a pure individual. In a community, he is like other species. He is a singular point and is not submitted to the same obligations and the same prohibitions as other men. The sorcerer or the priest are also the bearers of a superior technics through which natural forces are captured, or divine powers are rendered favorable. One man alone can stand up to the leader of the army. One alone can command his respect. The prophet Tiresias is more powerful than any other being defined by his function, since he is the technician of foreseeing the future. Even a king is bound to his function, despite the fact that he may be legibus solutus, above the law. In a community, the technician contributes a new and irreplaceable element, that of direct dialogue with the object, insofar as it is hidden from or accessible to the people of the community. From outside the body, the physician knows the mysterious functions that take place within the organs. The prophet reads in the entrails of victims the hidden fate of the community. The priest is in communication with the will of the gods and can modify their decisions, or at the very least, know their judgments and reveal them.
Right. So we can stop there. So here he's talking about this role of the technician, as he calls it. But this is sort of any figure in a society that has this knowledge or skill that is sort of out of the ordinary. So he gives the example of the doctor in the Homeric era. And there are other examples in other societies. I was just trying to find something quickly, but I didn't find a good link. But in certain West African societies, blacksmiths had this sort of special social role. They formed a sort of caste. They lived outside of the village with where other people lived, and they had special religious roles and so on. So in many societies, you have this figure, this social role of a person who has this this skill or knowledge that the rest of the society doesn't have, and he points out here that this, in the case of technicians, there's the social role of the technician is not sort of self-contained in the way that the social role of a king or any other social rule is determined. So the king is something that is determined just by virtue of the set of social roles in a given society. So a king is just someone who occupies this particular function and has these rights and these duties and so on. Whereas the technician is someone who has this connection to something extra social. Right. Yeah. Thanks, Angus. So there's a link here in the chat about the role of the blacksmith in West Africa. But yeah, so the blacksmith or the physician or the technician in general is someone who has a link to something extra social. So they have this connection to hidden capacities in nature. They have the ability to understand and to use some aspect of the natural world that is hidden to the rest of the society. And so this role of the technician, as we continue to read this chapter, we'll see that it allows for some individuation in a different way than in the other social roles, and so he calls this the pure individual. So it's an individual. A technician is an individual because in a purer sense than anyone else in the society, because they are not sort of integrated into society to the same extent as other social roles. So even the king is sort of a singular figure, but the king's role, the king's function within that society, sort of determines what the king is allowed to do, and what interests the king has, and so on. Whereas the technician has this extra social relationship that makes him a sort of figure that is distinct from the rest of society and makes him into this pure individual. Okay, so let's go on to the next. I guess this one.
Do you think this is like? Do you think this is kind of in tension with the end of the conclusion of the last volume, where, you know, part of his like ethics of individuation is kind of not being substantial and kind of self-enclosed individual? Seems like that's kind of close to what the technician is here.
I think the technician is not sort of a sort of substance or self-contained or anything along those lines, because the technician has this relationship to the natural world, or these hidden aspects of nature. So becoming a technician requires this sort of discipline where you're sort of subject to nature in order to gain these powers of controlling nature. So there's a certain humility or discipline that's required in order to become a technician and to gain these powers of understanding and controlling the hidden aspects of nature. And so because of that, I don't think the technician is self-contained in that sense. It's a sort of openness to these hidden aspects of nature rather than a closed interiority.
That makes sense.
But yeah, that's a good question, though. Yeah, I think in general, like for especially the second half of volume 1, he gives us like these different sort of sketches, and it's sometimes hard to see what the connection is between them, like how we're supposed to understand the different sketches in connection with each other, and yeah, so I think making those sorts of comparisons between different parts of the book is definitely a useful exercise. Okay, so yeah, let's go on to the next. I guess just this one paragraph before the section break, if someone else would like to read.
6 centuries before the birth of Jesus Christ, the engineer in the Greek cities of Ionia becomes the technician par excellence. He brings to these cities the power of expansion, and he is the one who is eumekanos technos, mechanically crafty and ingenious. Thales, an Anaximander, and an Anaximenes are technicians above all else. We should not forget that the first appearance of a free individual thought and a disinterested reflection is the product of technicians, i.e. men who know how to stand apart from the community in a direct dialogue with the world. Tannery is shown in his work Pour une histoire de la science Hélène the dominant role of technical thought in what he calls the Greek miracle. The miracle is the arrival within the community of the pure individual, the one who joins the two conditions of reflexive thought in it, organic life and technical life. These first technicians have revealed their strength by predicting a solar eclipse, just like Thales did. Technics and labor cannot be conflated. In fact, by losing its characteristic of operating on a hidden object, labor is no longer a technics. The veritable technician is the one who is a mediator between the community and the hidden or inaccessible object. Today, we call technicians those who in reality are specialized laborers, but do not put the community in relation with the hidden domain. An absolutely elucidated and divulged technics is no longer a technics, but a type of labor. Specialists are not veritable technicians, but laborers. The veritable technical activity is in the domain of scientific research, which, because it is research, is oriented toward objects or properties of objects that are still unknown. Free individuals are those who carry out research and thereby institute a relation with the non-social object. This seems to be related to the point that he makes later on about how technics is what kind of keeps open what would otherwise be a closed community. And I think that that's maybe why the aspect of the relation with the hidden object or the hidden properties of the object is important, because if it's already visible, then it's kind of already maybe accounted for within the adaptation of the community to its milieu. But if it's hidden, then its discovery or like the interaction with it forces the community to interact with the milieu differently. It's kind of stereotyped iteration.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think there's this the hiddenness of these aspects of nature that the technician is able to work with also means that there's no sort of integration of those aspects of nature into the social whole in the way that there is for other aspects of nature. And so it's only the technician who knows how to operate with these aspects of nature, and the rest of the society has to sort of accept this knowledge and skill of the technician as a given, rather than having an understanding of it themselves. And I think this point about Thales and Anaximander and Anaximenes as technicians is an interesting one, because there's the famous story about Thales that he from various like astronomical observations or some sort of observations, he was able to predict that there would be a big olive crop that year, and he bought up the whole crop in whatever, in Miletus, I think is his city. Anyway, he bought up the whole crop and made all kinds of money by because he predicted that it would be a good crop that year. And he was a military engineer, and so there was this role in ancient Greek society of the engineer who gives the city this extra capacity in military affairs, and it's these figures are some of the first people that start doing what we now would recognize as philosophy, and sort of reflecting on the origin of things and the relationships between things in sort of the broad sense, and who sometimes question the religious traditions of that society. I think it was it Anaximander? Oh no, sorry, that's Anaxagoras later on, who says that the earth is just a stone, and not a sort of divine entity of any kind. But so this role of the technician allows these people to sort of go beyond the received set of concepts and ideas and stories and so on that make up the culture that they live in. It gives them this access to a realm outside of that society. And then this last bit here, where he talks about how in our contemporary society, the technicians are the scientists. So we use the term technician, like, the person who comes to fix your TV or whatever, the technician. But this is obviously not a hidden skill or a hidden knowledge. It's just knowledge that you don't happen to have. There's a division of labor within society in terms of what knowledge and skills people specialize in. But the knowledge itself is completely open. If you go online and read about how TVs work, you can probably learn it all on your own if you really wanted to. But it's only in scientific research that there's this same sort of relationship with something unknown or hidden in nature, and not in these roles that we sort of typically call technicians, which are just sort of specialized workers that have the specialized skill, but not this relation to something unknown or hidden. Okay, so let's go on to the next bit. I can read the next page or so. Let me just see how long this section is. That's a couple pages, so let's break it up. Okay, section 2. The technical operation as a condition of individuation, invention and autonomy, community and technical trans-individual relation. The rapport of men to the worlds can in fact be effectuated either through the community, i.e. through labor, or from the individual to the object in a direct dialogue, i.e. technical effort. The technical object elaborated in this way defines a certain crystallization of creative human action and perpetuates it in being. Technical effort does not submit to the same temporal regime as labor. Labor exhausts itself in its own achievement, and the being who labors is alienated in his work, which increasingly becomes distant with respect to himself. Conversely, the technical being realizes the summation of an availability that always remains present. Effort, extended in time without dissipating, discursively constructs a coherent being that expresses the action or series of actions that have constituted it, and that conserves them as always present. The technical being mediates human effort and confers an autonomy on it that the community cannot confer on labor. The technical being is participable, insofar as the nature of the technical object resides not only in its actuality, but also in the information that it determines and that constitutes it. It can be reproduced without losing this information. As a being of information, it is therefore inexhaustibly fruitful. The technical object is open to being used or recreated by every human activity and is inserted into an impulse of universal communication. The sophists understood and expressed this value of technical effort, which frees man from the community and makes him a veritable individual. Man is not just a zoon politikon, or political animal, but also a zoon technikon, or a technical animal. And the communication of technical thought is imbued with the characteristic of universality down to its coarsest or most elementary forms. Auguste Comte noted the inherence of the necessary seeds of positivity to the technical operation. The technical operation, in fact, brings about what labor or the other communal functions cannot: the reactivity of the act. Constructive activity gives man the real image of his act, because what is currently the object of construction becomes the means for a later construction due to an ongoing mediatization. This continuous and open regime of the time of technical effort is what allows the individual to have a reactive awareness of his own action and to be his own norm to himself. Furthermore, technical norms are fully accessible to the individual without the need to resort to a social normativity. The technical object is either valid or not according to its internal characteristics, which express the schematism inherent in the effort by which it is constituted. An intrinsic normativity of the acts of the subject, which requires their internal coherence, is defined based on the inventive technical operation. These norms are never enough to produce invention, but their immanence to the subject conditions the validity of his effort. The technician can only act freely, for technical normativity is intrinsic with respect to the action that constitutes it. This normativity is not exterior or anterior to action, yet action is also not anomic because it is not fruitful unless it is coherent, and this coherence is its normativity. Technical normativity is valid insofar as it exists veritably in itself and not in the community. The adoption or refusal of a technical object by a society means nothing for or against the validity of this object. Technical normativity is intrinsic and absolute. It can even be said that the penetration of a new normativity into a closed community is made possible by way of technics. Technical normativity modifies the code of values of a closed society because there is a systematic of values, and by admitting a new technics, every closed society that introduces values inherent to this technics thereby carries out a new structuration of its code of values. Since there is no community that does not utilize any techniques or that never introduces new ones, there is no completely closed and unevolving community. Yeah, this bit about the sophists is interesting. I think, I'm not sure exactly who he has in mind here among the sophists, but it's possible that he's thinking of Protagoras, because in Plato's dialogue, the Protagoras, the sophist, appears, and he gives this account of the origin of humanity as having to do with technical knowledge. It's the story of Prometheus stealing fire and giving it to human beings, and so this knowledge of fire, of how to use fire, is sort of the core of technical knowledge that allows humans to found cities and to create pottery and metalworking and all sorts of other technical skills. And so for Protagoras, it's this technical knowledge that is sort of characteristic of human beings because humans don't have natural defenses in the way that other animals do, like claws or tusks or whatever. And so technical knowledge is sort of the way that human beings defend themselves against the rest of nature. And so I think that might be what he's thinking of here is this role of technical knowledge as sort of constituting what is a human being in the Protagoras. And so it's interesting here that he, again, like we saw this in the last section a little bit, but he sort of expands on it here. But there's a difference between labor and technical effort or technical action. So labor or work that uses, you might be using some sort of advanced technological tool or a piece of equipment to do your work, whether it's a computer or like in a factory where they have robots that are part of the work process. It's still work in the sense that you're not interacting with something extra social, this hidden aspect of nature, whereas technical effort has to do with the effort of actually creating a new technical object of some kind, or creating an improvement on an existing technical object, or some sort of effort directed towards the interaction of your interests and goals with some hidden aspect of nature, or an aspect of nature that hasn't been sort of brought to light yet. And so this technical effort is what is required for this pure individual to sort of constitute itself in opposition to the rest of society. And so what contrasts technical, or what is different about technical effort in comparison to other to work or other sort of operations that have a social value, is that it has its normativity is sort of intrinsic to it in a way that is not the case for other operations. So in work, you can have a norm of productivity, for example, but this is sort of imposed from the outside. It's not inherent to the work process that productivity is necessarily the goal of that work process. You can have other goals for work, and in other societies, there are other goals for work, and productivity is not necessarily the what is sought in the work process. Whereas in technical effort, the perfection of a technical object is as an intrinsic goal, and it's not something imposed on the technical effort from outside. It's a sort of it's a sort of relationship to this hidden aspect of nature, without sort of presupposing what that hidden aspect is going to be, and without imposing any norms from outside on how that relationship is supposed to work. And so there's because it has this intrinsic normativity, it's this technical effort has to have this sort of coherence. It has to produce something that sort of stands up to inspection or to other technicians' verification or something along those lines. And because it has this intrinsic normativity, it's not subject to the normativity of the society as a whole. And then this is sort of the mechanism by which there can be changes in a society. So even a society or even a group that is closer to the community end of the spectrum, that has this organic character, it and tends towards closedness. It's still, because it uses technical operations of various kinds, it still has this capacity for openness within it. It still has the capacity to undergo change and transformation as a result of technical developments.
This idea of the reactivity of the product of technical effort makes me think of the moral act in the conclusion of Volume 1 as something that can be taken back up again. And he even says that there's an availability to the technical being that always remains present, which I think maybe is the kind of like non-historically simultaneous co-presence that he talked about in that conclusion with regard to the ethical or moral act.
Yeah, it definitely sounds similar. I think, so he talks about this universal communication of the technical object. So there's a sort of network of technical objects with each other that every technical object is related to other technical objects in various ways. Like it either it uses another technical object as a component, or you have to use technical object A in order to produce technical object B, or one of them might be a raw material that the other one works upon, or whatever. So there's this network of interactions between different technical objects that sort of constitutes this universal communication, and so this allows, actually in connection with the other book on the mode of existence of technical objects, he in the third part of that book, when he's characterizing technical or the technical mode of existence of human beings, what he argues is specific to this mode of existence is the fact that technical objects are displaceable. So that whereas magical objects or the magical mode of existence is tied to specific sites, sacred sites, or sites that have this specific power, and places and times that have this specific power. The technical object can be displaced, so you can, if you can create a pot or a wheel or a bow and arrow or whatever, you can move that object to a different place, or someone from a different society can learn how to use it and how to make it, and take it up in a completely different a completely different social context. And so I think this aspect of the technical object is part of what he has in mind here when he talks about sort of being able to recreate the technical object. This is a sort of intrinsic characteristic of the technical object, the fact that it can be displaced and used in any sort of context outside of the original context of creation. All right, so let's go on to the next bit on 413 from every social group. If someone else would like to read.
Yeah, I can go again. Every social group is a mixture of community and society. If a community is defined as a code of extrinsic obligations with respect to individuals, and if a society is defined as an interiority with respect to individuals. Communal effort and technical effort are antagonistic in a determined society. Communal forces tend to incorporate techniques in a system of social obligations by assimilating technical effort to a labor. But technical effort obliges the community to always rectify its structure so it can incorporate ever new creations. And this effort submits the community's structure to judgment according to its own values by analyzing the community's dynamic characteristics that this structure predetermines. Positivist technicism is a very clear example of the way in which such a thought introduces new values into the community and is more than a sort of sociology. A sociology that believes itself capable of grasping human reality in its specificity does not take into account the pure individual and techniques in their genesis, and therefore defines the social only by way of obligation. But in doing so, it ignores an important part of social reality, a part that can, in certain cases, become more dominant. Collective reality is indissociably communal and social, but these two characteristics are antagonistic, and monistic sociology cannot account for this antagonism. It would be incorrect to maintain that the community only reacts against the dissociating effects of the individual who seek to satisfy his egoistic desires. An inventor or a scientist is no more egoistical than a painter or a poet. However, the community accepts the painter or the poet but balks at invention, since in invention there is something beyond the community that establishes a trans-individual relation, going from individual to individual without passing through the communal integration guaranteed by a collective mythology. The immediate relation between individuals defines a social existence in the proper sense of the term, whereas the communal relation does not make individuals communicate with one another directly, but constitutes a totality, through the intermediary of which they communicate indirectly and without a precise awareness of their individuality. A theory of community overlooks the dynamism of a society of individuals. To be complete, sociology must integrate a study of techniques. Just like the humanism of the sophists, humanism must also integrate a study of techniques. It could be objected that technical creation is something rare, and that under these conditions, individual behavior can only be very exceptional. Nevertheless, there is a radiation of values around a behavior, and a behavior is not isolated in the sum of the individual's actions, no more than an individual is isolated in the social milieu in which he exists. The individual's very nature is to communicate, to radiate around him the information that propagates what he creates. This is what is made possible by technical invention, which is unlimited in space and time. Technical invention propagates without losing strength, even when it is associated with another element or is integrated into a more complex whole. The work of the individual can indeed propagate beyond the individual himself in two ways: as a technical work, properly speaking, or as a consequence of this work in the form of a modification of the collective conditions of existence which imply values and requirements. Thus, the invention of a rapid means of communication is not nullified by the discovery of a faster means. Even if the technical procedures are totally transformed, there remains a dynamic continuity that consists in the fact that the introduction of the first mode of transport into the community has developed a requirement of rapidity that serves to promote the second mode strongly. The first mode has created the function and inserted it into the set of dynamisms of the community. Every technical device, dispositif, modifies the community to a certain degree and introduces a function that can make possible the advent of other technical devices. Thus, it is inserted into a community that does not exclude change but stimulates it, since requirements always exist before their realizations. In this sense, the technical being is converted into civilization. Furthermore, a technical being, even when it is barely integrated into the community, has value as an object to be comprehended. It requires a type of perception and conceptualization that aims to comprehend the technical being by recreating it. The technical being therefore exists as a seed of thought that contains a normativity extending far beyond itself. The technical being in this second manner, therefore, constitutes a path that transmits from individual to individual a certain capacity of creation, as if there were a dynamism common to all research and a society of individuals who create technical beings.
Right. So here we have again the contrasts or the relationship between society and community. How every group is both a society and a community, and so there's different aspects. These two aspects are operating at the same time in every social group, and he argues here that technical effort, as we have discussed before, is opposed to communal effort, and so there's a sense in which technical effort and the effort of creation of a new technical object or a perfected technical object is something that is not integrated into the functioning of the community. And so he argues that a monistic sociology, so a sociology that would only recognize the communal or only recognize the social, is incapable of sort of recognizing this antagonism between the two aspects. And so a sociology that doesn't have a role or doesn't assign a role to technical creation is a sort of one-sided sociology. It doesn't grasp this other side of human existence. And then he wants to argue against maybe a possible misunderstanding or misconception, which would be that in technical creation, the individual is sort of satisfying their own individual desires, and then the communal reaction to that technical creation would be a sort of defense mechanism. And he argues that in technical creation, the inventor or the scientist is not really acting in a self-interested manner in any sense greater than the poet or the painter does. So, of course, scientists and inventors are interested in wealth and fame and all the sort of self-interested goals that any of us are interested in, but they aren't sort of more interested in those goals, or they aren't more motivated by those factors than the artist or the painter is. Whereas in the painter or the poet or whatever other figure can be integrated into the community in a way that the technician can't be. As we saw in the previous section, the technician is always sort of external to the community in some sense, and so here he introduces again this notion of a trans individual as what is characteristic of the technician. So the technician allows this technical knowledge that the technician has allows for this trans individual relation to sort of bypass the communal structure. So there's a relationship between individuals that is not sort of mediated by the community. And this is something that is obviously dangerous to a community. It sort of makes the community fragile, and it makes it into something that can be destroyed by technical knowledge and this trans individual character of technical knowledge. So he talks about how another sort of objection that you could make would be that technical creation is something rare. There are not that many instances of people inventing new techniques and new technologies, and so it's not that important for sociology to have an account of technical creation. And then so his response to this objection is that there's a sort of rule of technical invention that goes beyond the actual act of creation of a new technical object. There's a sort of what he calls it here a propagation from this technical act, this effort of creation of a new technical object that has this effect of restructuring the community. And then so he gives this example of how if you have the invention of a new mode of transportation, like I think he's thinking here probably of railways in the 18th and 19th century. This introduces a whole new sort of requirement for speed of transportation, which didn't really exist before. The speed of transportation was more or less fixed from the time that humans first domesticated horses until the time when railway travel started to become possible in the 19th century. And so it's only with the introduction of railways that this requirement for speed of transportation starts to become active in the community. And so even though railway travel is no longer the sort of peak of scientific or technical progress as it was at the time, and there are faster modes of transportation, this effect of the railways in bringing about speed of transportation as a requirement is still active in our community, and so the technical act of creating a train or a railway is still effective in our everyday life, even if we don't use railway travel in the same way that people did in the 19th century. And then the second aspect of how a technical object or the act of creation of a technical object sort of reverberates in a community is because it presents a new object for understanding. It sort of poses a problem for that community, and so like again, sticking with 19th century examples, the whole science of thermodynamics was developed as a result of the development of steam engines in the 19th century, and so there was a sort of technical knowledge, a non-scientific knowledge of the efficiency of steam engines and how much power you could get out of a certain amount of fuel. And then scientists started to examine this sort of domain of knowledge and try to define like what is the limit, what is the most efficient a steam engine could possibly be. And so that's sort of the origin of the science of thermodynamics. And so there's this sort of problem that a technical object poses to a community that brings about a new conceptualization and a new set of problems, a new set of ideas for that community. Yeah, exactly. Sadi Carnot, who there's the other one, the other text, the theory of, I forget the exact wording, but anyway, the sort of introduction of the ideal thermodynamic machine, which Carnot introduces in the 19th century. Okay, let's go on to the next page. Let's see. Yeah, we can read a page or so. So I'll read this. The second direction also pertains to the transformation of the technical being into an element of civilization. Civilization is consequently the set of the community's dynamisms and of the dynamisms of different societies that encounter in the world of technical beings a condition of compatibility. Even if the notion of progress cannot be directly accepted and should be elaborated by a reflexive labor, It is indeed this compatibility of the community and of societies that finds a meaning in the notion of progressive development. Progress is the characteristic of development that integrates into a whole both the meaning of successive discontinuous discoveries as well as the stable unity of a community. Community and society can become synergistic through the intermediary of technical progress. Ultimately, the technical being's own consistency is constituted as an expanding reality within the temporal continuity of the technical universe, in which a twofold simultaneous and successive solidarity links technical beings together through a mutual conditioning. We could speak of an internal resonance of the technical universe within which each technical being effectively intervenes as a real condition of existence for other technical beings. Each technical being is therefore like a microcosm that encompasses within its conditions of monadic existence a very large number of other valid technical beings. A circular causality creates a reciprocity of conditions of existence that gives the technical universe its consistency and its unity. This current unity persists through a successive unity that renders humanity comparable to someone, as Pascal says, who would always grasp everything without ever forgetting. The value of the individual's dialogue with the technical object is thus to conserve human effort and to create a domain of the trans-individual, distinct from the community, in which the notion of freedom takes on a meaning and transforms the notion of individual destiny, but does not nullify it. The fundamental characteristic of the technical being is to integrate time into a concrete and consistent existence. It is consequently the correlate of the individual's self-creation. No doubt this aspect of the technical object hasn't been completely ignored. A particular form of the technical object as a seat of civilization has been recognized and honored for a long time. The artificial aesthetic object, i.e. the objet d'art. The religious and magical origins of the objet d'art were enough to indicate its value, but we should note that the objet d'art has become disconnected from its origins and has become a pure instrument of communication, a free means of expression, even at a time when the poet was still a soothsayer. However, the aesthetic object's status of existence is precarious. It is reinserted into the life of the community obliquely and is only accepted if it corresponds to one of the already existing vital dynamisms. Every artist then remains the tertius of a community. This kind of recourse consists in forming a community of people of taste, an informed cenacle of authors and critics who cultivate pure art. But then pure art becomes the symbolon of the members of this community and thereby loses its pure character. It closes in upon itself. Surrealism was the latest attempt to save pure art. This effort has a very noble sense. It is not up to us to say whether surrealism was paralyzed by its own effort and has ended up in an asceticism despite itself. But we should note that the liberating paths of surrealism lead to the construction of an object that is stable, self-organized like an automaton, independent from its creator, and indifferent to the one who encounters it. Surrealism, so to speak, is in the hyperfunctional manner of constructing the object. This object is neither useful nor agreeable. It is consistent unto itself and turned back to itself, and it is absurd because it has not complied with the obligation of signifying in a reality other than its own. So here he maybe qualifies a little bit what he had said earlier about how the poet or the painter is integrated into the community, because he suggests that art in the modern sense of the term is a sort of technical object. A painting or a sculpture or whatever is a technical object in some sense of the word, or in the specific way that he wants to use this word. Again, he's sort of drawing on the third part of on the mode of existence of technical objects here, but in that book, in that third part, he gives this genetic anthropology, so a series of different modes of existence of the human being, and he begins with the magical mode of existence, and then he sees this as being split into technical and religious modes of existence, and so he just sort of alludes to this genetic anthropology here, but he suggests that the work of art has its origin in magical and religious modes of existence, and is sort of a remnant of these modes of existence in our society today. but he argues that the work of art has become disconnected from this magical and religious context and plays a role of a sort of pure aesthetic um, instrument or a means of expression that is not connected to this religious and magical context. But then there's this sort of second moment where art for art's sake becomes sort of the uh, principle around which a new community forms. So even if the art object is a technical object in a sense and sort of surpasses what a community is capable of absorbing, um, you can form like the new community of avant-garde artists. And over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries, there were all these sort of artistic communities that developed, and so he points here to the Surrealists as one example of this. So it was like a group of artists who were dedicated to a certain way of practicing art and sort of formed this community of artists and critics that were sort of self-contained in a sense. And yeah, so there's this second moment where the art object becomes the principle of the formation of a new community. So there's a sort of constant tension between the art object as a technical object that surpasses the community and can't be fully integrated into the community, and then the formation of a new community around that art object. And so these are sort of always in tension with each other. Oh, I just realized there was only one paragraph left in that section. I should have just finished it. Oh well. So if someone else would like to read that last paragraph of the section, and then we can stop to discuss.
Yeah, I can read. The object is endowed with internal resonance, which is palpable even in poetic forms or in painting. The surrealist object is an absolute machine. There is no function that remains essential to it, even that of goetia. For it to be produced by chance would require an encounter that would break the natural finality of an ensemble and allow for the appearance of a being divorced from its function, which would consequently make this being absolute extraordinary. The surrealistic object tends toward a positive surreal, and one of the paths of the surreal is that of the technical being, which is extraordinary because it is new and beyond utility. The technical being, reproduced and disclosed through industry, loses its surreal value to the extent that the anesthesia of everyday use deprives perception of the object's singular characteristics. Seen as a utensil, the technical being no longer has meaning for the individual. The community appropriates it, normalizes it, and gives it a use value that is foreign to its own dynamic essence. But every technical object can be rediscovered by the individual whose technical taste and technical culture are sufficiently developed. Thus, the technical object is a surreal, but it can only be felt as such if it is grasped by the pure individual, by someone who can be creative, and not by a user who treats the technical object as a mercenary or a slave. It seems to be saying that the surrealist work of art is like a technical object in this paragraph, but it doesn't really make sense. Doesn't really make sense to me because he said that the surrealist work of art is not useful, and I don't really know. The idea of the technical object being kind of essentially not useful doesn't really make sense to me.
This is sort of a difficult passage. I think the idea here is that a surrealist object is a sort of, it's almost like a machine for producing a certain experience in the viewer or the audience. It has no function in the sense of performing some task that satisfies particular human needs or something along those lines, and it's not agreeable. It's not designed to be beautiful in the way that sort of classical art objects are, but it has the effect of producing an experience of some kind in the viewer. And it's this pure sort of experience producing capacity of the object that I think he has in mind here. And then so he points to the way that this is a sort of extraordinary capacity of an art object, even a surrealist art object. So it's only because it's this particular object, this sort of unique object, that it has the capacity to produce this kind of experience. Whereas once you have mass reproduction of whatever object, it no longer has this capacity to produce this extraordinary experience in the viewer. And so once something becomes an object of everyday use, then it's only its usefulness that sort of becomes relevant or of interest in evaluating that object. It no longer serves to produce these extraordinary experiences. And then, so once it becomes an object of everyday use, then it becomes integrated into the community. And then it no longer has this capacity to produce new experiences. But then at the same time, any technical object, even one that is not necessarily produced for the sake of producing an experience, this technical object can be sort of can become the object of a surreal experience. If the individual develops what he calls here a technical taste and technical culture, this sort of appreciation for technical objects for their own sake, then the individual can learn to experience technical objects as surreal objects that produce this experience. And he's going to talk about this more in later sections, but he contrasts this with treating a technical object as a slave or a mercenary. So just as something that does useful work for us, that sort of makes life more agreeable in some way. And this is like a sort of misunderstanding or not grasping of a technical object as it is itself. I think in relation to Heidegger, I think it might not be as opposed as it might seem, because the technical object is integrated into, for Heidegger, the technical object, the object that is ready to hand, is integrated into a sort of communal structure of being in the world, and so it's not sort of integrated into it. It's not something that is connected to the individual as such. Whereas and then sort of in contrast to that, the individual doesn't necessarily have any relation to the ready-to-hand object. The individual, insofar as it is an individual, is not necessarily connected to anything ready-to-hand. And so I think it's maybe a more similar sort of understanding, or more compatible understanding than it might seem in the first instance. And so it's only for Simondon, it's only the individual who has the capacity to understand a technical object in itself, rather than as an object of utility. And it's only insofar as you treat a technical object as an object of utility, you're treating it as something integrated into the community, rather than as you're not working with it or behaving towards it as an individual. But so that there is a contrast with Heidegger here in I think the sort of valorization of the technical object. So in the question concerning technology, Heidegger has a sort of, well, I think it's pretty clearly negative valuation of technology, even though he sort of says in that text that he doesn't want to just sort of criticize technology in like the sort of standard sense of that word, but he obviously finds technical objects unsettling in various ways, and his examples of being in the world are always drawn from sort of pre-industrial technological objects like hammers and so on, rather than factories and railways and airplanes and so on. So yeah, there's the jugs and the wine jug and so on. It looks like a hammer. I think for Simondon, there's this a sense in which having an understanding of technical objects is inherently valuable, and there's a certain positive valorization of technical objects in a way that there isn't for Heidegger. For Heidegger, the technical objects are sort of inherently deprived of an understanding of being, and so you can't really you can't. Sorry, I'm being distracted by the the chat here. You can't really have a grasp of the question of being if you're sort of distracted by technical objects, and you have to sort of remove yourself from this context of technical objects to have a grasp of the question of being for Heidegger. Whereas for Simondon, having a grasp of technical objects and understanding their functioning and so on is something that is inherently valuable, and that allows for an understanding of the being of those technical objects. Okay, so let's go on to section 3, if someone else would like to read.
Again, section 3, individuation of the products of human effort. Until now, we have not attempted to analyze the technical object other than indirectly through its rapport to the one who produces or uses it, without trying to define its internal structure and dynamism. However, if the object's rapport to man, in this case, presents the characteristics of a relation, we should rediscover in the technical object an analogical structure and an analogical human dynamism. These two internal characteristics of the technical object cannot be understood if the technical object is conflated with the tool, which then makes it lose its individuality and therefore its own value. As Piaget has remarkably shown based on archaeological and ethnographic considerations, the tool is deprived of its own individuality because it is grafted onto another individualized organism's body part, because its function is to extend, reinforce, and protect, but not replace the latter. A spyglass is not a technical being endowed with its own individuality, since it supposes the eye and has no dynamic meaning except in front of an eye, or in front of a photographic apparatus which prepares the view that the eye will observe. Its dynamism is incomplete. The spyglass is made to be manipulated and controlled by the individual who sees, or by the photograph, and these individuals are humans. Pliers are the refined and hardened extension of human nails or human hands. A hammer is an unfeeling and hardened fist. The evolution of the forms of the door knocker show that in the beginning it was conceived as a hand holding a bronze ball, with the wrist being replaced by a pivot affixed to the door. The Greek key was originally a thinned arm ending with a hook, and one would introduce it into a narrow cleft in the door through which one could grab the interior bolt. Theocritus describes the priestess bearing on her shoulder the key of a temple, the insignia of her function and her majesty. The modern key, in some sense, is still a hook for opening a door. Conversely, rather than extensions of the human individual, motors are beings that contribute from outside an available energy, according to the individual's needs. They are endowed with exteriority relative to the structure and dynamic of the individual. This is why they initially appear to be endowed with individuality. The slave is the primordial model for every motor. The slave is a being who contains his complete organization and his organic autonomy within himself, even when his action is subjugated by an accidental domination. The domesticated animal is also an organism. Even with the degradation of the state of domestication or slavery, the organic and living motor conserves an inalienable individuality due to its natural spontaneity. The blind slave who flees along the road from Larissa is an individual, just like the enraged animal that becomes wild again at the risk of its own life. The revolt of animals and slaves, despite the whip and the gallows, shows that these organic motors have an autonomy, a nature that can at least manifest its autonomy in destructive fury beyond any estimation of the dangers or the chances. Despite the well-known definition, a slave is never completely a speaking tool. The tool has no individuality.
Right. So here we have a contrast between tools and machines in the proper sense, or technical objects in the proper sense of the term. And so a tool is something that serves to extend a human capacity in some way, and it doesn't have the role of an individual. And so he gives some of these examples here, like hammers, pliers, etc. These are just extensions of a human organ or a part of the human body in a way that makes it more usable for a particular task. Whereas a machine, in the proper sense of the term, is an individual. And so he talks here about a motor as standing in for a slave. And so I think this distinction actually goes back to Marx, if I remember correctly. He talks about this distinction between tools and then machines that replace a worker. So the machine, in the proper sense of the term, is an individual. It stands in for a human being, but it always has this contrast with the individual human being in that the human being always has the capacity to revolt. So we'll see more about this in the next couple paragraphs, but there's always a capacity for the human being to refuse to work or to revolt, or in some sense to not cooperate with the work process in a way that a machine can't. A machine can not function properly, but it can't refuse to work. And it's interesting also, he mentions animals here, because animals also refuse to work sometimes. They they can just decide, I don't feel like pulling this plow anymore, and sit down, and no matter how much you whip it or whatever, it just refuses to work anymore. So there's a certain autonomy that both animals and humans have that a machine does not have, even though the machine is sort of standing in for the individual animal or the individual human being. Okay, let's go on. Yeah, we probably have time for one more page or so. I can read the next page. However, the technical being is more than the tool and less than the slave. It possesses an autonomy, but one that is relative, limited, without any veritable exteriority with respect to the man who constructs it. The technical being has no nature. It can be a functional analogy of the individual, but it is never a veritable organic individual. Let's suppose that a machine has been endowed with the most perfect teleological mechanisms by its constructors, and that it is capable of carrying out the fastest and most perfect labors. This machine, which is functionally equivalent to thousands of humans, even so will not be a veritable individual. The best calculating machine does not have the same degree of reality as an ignorant slave, because the slave can revolt, while the machine cannot. With respect to man, the machine cannot have any veritable exteriority because it has no veritable interiority within itself. The machine can lose its regularity and then present functional characteristics analogous to wild behavior in a living being, but it cannot revolt. Revolt, in fact, implies a profound transformation of finalized behaviors and not a malfunctioning of behavior. The machine is capable of self-adaptive behaviors. There is nevertheless a big difference between a self-adaptive behavior and a conversion that no external resemblance can disguise. Man is capable of conversion in the sense that he can change goals throughout the course of his existence. Individuality is beyond teleological mechanism because it can modify the orientation of this finality. Conversely, the machine is more perfect when its automatism allows it to self-regulate according to its predetermined finality. But the machine is not self-creative. Even if we suppose that the machine regulates its own teleological mechanisms during its functioning, we only obtain a machine that is capable, by means of this teleology acting on a teleology, integrating the results of the preceding stages of its functioning as data. This is a machine that increasingly reduces the margin of indetermination of its functioning according to the data of the milieu and in conformity with the convergent determinism. Consequently, this machine adapts. But adaptation is possible according to two opposite processes. The first is what we have described as training, which ends in a more or less stereotyped behavior and an increasingly restricted link with a determined milieu. The second form of adaptation is learning, which on the contrary increases the availability of the being with respect to the different milieus in which it is found by developing the richness of the system of symbols and of dynamisms that integrate past experience according to divergent determinism. In the second case, the quantity of information characterizing the structure and the reserve of the schemas contained in the being increases. The successive abrupt leaps that can be called conversions mark the moments where, because the unintegrated quantity of information has become too large, the being unifies itself by changing its internal structure to adopt the new structure that integrates the accumulated information. Right, so this is what we were just talking about, how the machine is not capable of revolts and not capable of refusing to work. And so here he's drawing a firm distinction between the human individual and the machine that sort of approximates towards an individual. And so we can have a machine can malfunction, and we sometimes sort of jokingly say that it's refusing to work, or it's the machine is revolting, or something like that. But there's always a distinction in the fact that the slave who revolts is the slave is sort of proposing or trying to implement a new finalism, a new set of goals for behavior, whereas the machine that breaks down or malfunctions is not sort of proposing a new set of goals or trying to implement a new set of goals. It's just not working properly. And so he gives this sort of thought experiment of you can suppose that you have this machine that operates in the most automatic way you can think of. It replaces thousands of workers. It's the perfect machine in whatever sense of that term. But this machine is not capable of selecting or trying to implement a new set of goals. It's always oriented towards whatever it was built to be oriented towards. And so here he talks about the notion of adaptation, and there's sort of two opposed senses in which you can talk about adaptation. So on the one hand, you have adaptation, which sort of means a regulation of an object in accordance with a sort of predetermined goal. And so this is what we were talking about at the beginning with the homeostatic mechanisms. And so living beings have this capacity to preserve themselves in particular states or to orient themselves towards goal states. And then certain technical objects can sort of mimic that capacity. And so you can have a technical object that's designed to always face towards the sun and charge its solar panels or something along those lines. and that's a relatively simple machine to construct. But then there's a second sense of adaptation, which doesn't mean sort of reducing the difference between a target state and a present state. The second form of adaptation is what he calls learning. And what this has to do with is not sort of an adaptation to an existing milieu, an existing environment. It's a capacity to adapt to multiple different environments. And so someone who learns how to drive, for example, is a better driver if they're capable of driving not just one specific route or one specific set of climatic conditions and one specific vehicle and so on, but they can drive different vehicles, and they can drive in different cities, and they can drive whether it's raining or snowing or whatever. That person is a better driver the more different types of environments they can exercise the skill of driving in. And so I think that's what he has in mind here with learning. It's not just a sort of reducing the difference between a target state and a present state, like the first form of adaptation. It's a sort of enrichment of a skill set that allows for an object, whether it's a person or a machine in theory. It allows this object to expand its capacities to operate in different environments. And so he argues that this second form of adaptation, this learning, is something that machines are not capable of. And so it'd be interesting to see what he might make of so-called machine learning, and whether he would see this as just a sort of sophisticated instance of the first kind of adaptation, or whether he would want to revise this distinction and say that some machines are capable of learning in the sense that he uses the term. My guess is that he would see what we call machine learning as just a sophisticated form of adaptation in the first sense, in terms of reducing the difference between a target state and a present state, because the way they work, machine learning systems are generally involved. There's generally some sort of process of reducing the error in predictions of some kind, and so there's the same sort of structure or dynamic of making the goal state and the present state coincide as closely as possible. So I think he would see machine learning as an instance of the first kind of adaptation rather than learning in the proper sense of the term. Just looking at the time, I don't think we have enough time to finish this section because it's another two and a half pages or so. So I would suggest that we stop here for today and pick up from 419 next time, if that works for everyone.
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay, cool. So thanks everyone for joining in today, and hope to see you all next week.